Well, Dr. Christopher Labos is a cardiologist, has a master's degree in epidemiology, and he's a frequent media commentator and now an author. And Mike Cohen here, in conjunction with the suburban newspaper, where I also write a monthly column. Well, I write a weekly column, but I write a monthly column on books and local authors. And it's been great. And as soon as I met Dr. Labos recently, when we met at Lauren Hill Academy and we talked about the book, I said, I want to get a copy. And his new book, Does Coffee Cause Cancer? I read it in basically one or two sittings. It's really, really great. So, Dr. Labos, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So great to have you. First off, let's just go down memory lane. I've been corresponding with you for years, last many years, back and forth by email, by phone. With you helping us educate the student body, certainly during the COVID period. And then I finally got to meet you in person at Lauren Hill Academy when you came back to speak to your school. So bring us back to your days at Lauren Hill Academy in Saint Laurent and what that meant for you in terms of where you are today as such a prominent member of society.
Well, yeah, as you said, so I went to high school at Lauren Hill Academy in Ville Saint Laurent. It was a great time. I had made friendships that have lasted me my entire lifetime. It's really where I started learning about science and certainly got my first introduction to the healthcare field via the HOPS program, which was running at the time and is still running now. So that was a great introduction. And I mean, I had a lot of great experiences. We did, math competitions, we did debating stuff, we played a lot of sports. And I had a very good core group of friends that really allowed me to have almost what would have passed for a Renaissance education back in the day, where we were trying a whole bunch of different stuff. And then, of course, once you move on, you have to specialize. And I ultimately specialized into medicine. But I think having that diversity, especially in your early education, what would almost be called a humanist education back then, gives you the versatility to be able to be a media person. Because when you're dealing with the media, it's not enough to just be a factual expert on a particular subject. You have to know how to communicate to people. You have to know how to explain stuff to people, to simplify it sometimes, and to put things into a broader context. Because more often than not, and especially we saw this during the pandemic, it's not just a question of what does the science say. You really have to understand human nature and society at large and think about what the broader implications are to any particular action or policy.
Yeah, and you kind of jumped to my next question, which was about that. I mean, you really, you've been known in the media for quite some time, over many years with your commentaries, but COVID really brought you into the spotlight. How did you become you became almost like the go-to person Canada-wide media on COVID? And I know you have a degree in epidemiology, but you're a cardiologist. How did that all pan out?
Well, I mean, so I had been writing for the Montreal Gazette for a few years at that point. I'd been doing regular hits with CGAD and with CTV, with Mitsumi. So I'd had that background in the media there, but it was very much sort of ad hoc to a very large degree. Like whenever something would happen, we would do something, and it really depended on what the news of the day was. But I did have that background. I was writing, it wasn't an official column at that point. I was sort of just writing op-eds for the Montreal Gazette, and then those would usually lead to other interviews. And I did a few things nationally here and there. But once COVID hit, and especially at the beginning, I had written some early things about, masks and about the sensitivity and specificity of testing. And once COVID hit, I mean, there was basically no other news because there was no sports. Politics had, essentially shut down because all the politicians were from home. And so the media, both locally and nationally, were looking for people who could explain what was going on.
Yeah.
And, the question was like, well, who's a COVID expert? And the reality was, I think we all sort of realized nobody was a COVID expert because nobody knew anything about this virus. I mean, we could infer certain things about what we knew about other viruses, although those ended up not actually really applying to COVID, because COVID was, very different than the flu, very different than a lot of other viruses out there. And so it really became a question of, could you consume data quickly? Could you analyze it? Could you put it in context?
Mm-hmm.
And with a lot of these questions that were very sort of complicated about, should we have lockdowns? Should we have not? Should we have school closures or should we have not? What are the policies that should be in place? They weren't just purely scientific issues. They were societal issues. And so that's where it really became important to be able to understand doubt and to quantify doubt and to say, honestly, look, we don't really know. We're doing this because it seems like the best solution at the time, and acknowledging that uncertainty, which, was not always present in a lot of the information landscape out there. And so, why did I do so much media stuff? I mean, when the media realizes that you are good at what you do, they will keep asking you back. And if you make yourself available, you can do it because not everybody is good at public speaking, right? Not everybody is good at communicating scientific information. And so if you are well equipped to do that sort of thing, they will ask you back. And if you have the flexibility to make it happen, well, you can go, on TV, on radio, and print, what have you, and, really try to sort of put stuff in context for people, which I think is what a lot of people wanted because they were just so confused and so overwhelmed, especially at the beginning. Having somebody who could sort of just break it down and put it into context, I think was helpful for a lot of people.
And you did and still do a great job at that. So we're in January of 2024. It's almost 4 years since the pandemic. Are we still in a pandemic? Are we going to live with this COVID fear the rest of our lives?
Well, it depends what definition you want to apply to the words pandemic, right? COVID has clearly not gone away. It probably never will at this point, the way things are going, unless something drastic happens. There is some interesting work being done with different types of vaccines, mucosal vaccines, sort of things that you can spray directly into the nose that would, in theory, coat the lining of your nose and throat and lungs, and that might prevent infections from happening in a much more effective way than the current vaccines do. So, I mean, it's very possible that something could come and change the situation. I mean, right now in the foreseeable future, probably not. There probably will be more COVID in the winter than there is in the summer. COVID hasn't really stuck to the traditional seasonal variation that we see with influenza, but it looks as if it's getting into that type of pattern. So we'll see. I mean, by the strict definition of what a pandemic means, which is, growing case numbers across multiple countries, it's hard to say because we don't really know what the numbers are going to look like. It's clearly not the same situation now that it was 4 years ago, but it hasn't really gone away and it's still making a lot of people sick. And the problem is, we have a lot of COVID, influenza, RSV, a lot of these typical respiratory viruses that are unfortunately making people sick in a healthcare system that is less able to accommodate them. So while the situation with COVID might be different than it was 4 years ago, the status of our healthcare system is very different than it was 4 years ago as well, because a lot of people have left. There's been a lot of burnout. There's a lot of issues in the healthcare system. So you always have to gauge it that way as well. I mean, my advice to people, half jokingly, but also kind of seriously, is don't get sick. Like, really don't get sick if you can avoid it, because it is hard to access medicine these days. It's not impossible. And if you're critically ill, you will get the care that you need, but it is, it's not easy. So honestly, at this point, at this time, just don't get sick if you can avoid it.
Now I know why you're the COVID expert. You explain it so well. So this book that you did, first off, it's a really very well-crafted book, I have to say, very different than any book I've ever read. I mean, on the surface, when you look at the title, you think, oh, this is a medical book. But you explain very early in the book, first off, despite the fact of your disclaimer at the beginning that you are not the main character, just pages later, as I read it, there was no way I saw Christopher Labos in every photo in my head of him. It was you to me. I mean, I know it's a fictitious story, but to basically give a quick synopsis, a doctor's going on a plane to a conference. He meets a couple of real characters. They talk nonstop about medical stuff, and he goes to his conference, sees his old buddy from medical school, and then meets this beautiful woman working in a coffee shop, and kind of a romance ensues. just wow, like not what I expected. So first off, how did you come up with this concept, first of all?
It was sort of an, excuse me, it was sort of an iterative concept. The initial draft of the book was going to be, I guess, a more conventional medical book, like the type that you've, heard of before, dealing with a lot of these food myths. So I sort of mapped it out, and, you get a literary agent, you pitch it to a publisher. And we had a conversation. It was like, well, is there some way that we could sort of spice it up? And at some point, the publisher had said, have you ever heard of this book called The Wealthy Barber? And actually, I hadn't, believe it or not. And then I looked into it, and it's like, oh, it was this idea for people who have never heard the book before. It's a financial planning book, but the premise of the book is there's this barber, and people go into the barber shop, and he gives them financial advice as he's cutting their hair. And he was like, could you do something that almost had a narrative feel to it? And for a while, I had been doing a podcast with my friend Jonathan. The podcast is called The Body of Evidence. And that is also a bit of a weird podcast, because most podcasts are very interview based, right? You bring on a guest, you interview them, you talk about something. It's really just the two of us. And we're essentially playing characters. We're playing versions of ourselves. So we're having this conversation, but it's also a bit of a zany conversation. There's jokes, there's digressions. And there are sort of skits almost. There's like an opening skit that sort of sets the stage for a discussion on whatever the medical topic of the day is. And I thought, it'd be interesting if we could take the podcast idea and sort of bring it into a book. And I said, well, how about we do it that way? Let me have a main character who's going in there, bumping into people and having conversations about food and science. And they were like, okay, that's not a bad idea. Write up a sample chapter and see how it goes. So I rewrote one of the chapters, the one about coffee. And I said, well, if it's going to be a coffee, let me set it in a coffee shop, and he'll be talking to a barista. And so we had this conversation, and I showed it to a friend of mine. And I said, what do you think? And she said, pretty good. But I kept expecting him to ask her out at the end. And the minute she said that, I understood that this was actually supposed to be a romantic comedy. And so I ended up changing the narrative to have these characters and give them a little bit more personality, a little bit more backstory. So they weren't just narrative devices to advance the plot. They are characters that have their own story arcs. And so I made it a lot funnier and a lot, and I think a better book, in the sense that you can, if you're not interested in the science at all, just read this book and enjoy the story, and maybe just pick up a few things along the way. But if you are interested in the science, you can read the book and then look at all the references in the back to really get into the nitty gritty of the statistics and the medical studies.
Yes, and I learned a lot. I mean, you did a lot of research, and what I liked in the epilogue is at the very end, you actually had a summary after the epilogue, and you basically told us how you got the research on each subject, but you weaved it into a conversation with a very annoying couple. I found them very annoying. Obviously it was fictitious, because I don't know a woman who would spend hours on the phone with this guy she likes talking about vitamin D, but that's another story. But the reality is that you interspersed such information. I mean, I really learned a lot about, just looking at some of the topics, like really, does coffee cause cancer? Should you eat a hot dog? The benefits of vitamin C, intermittent fasting, vitamin D. So how long did it take you to do this whole book?
So to write the book, I wrote it over the course of a year. It probably wouldn't have taken me a year to write if I was doing this full time, but I still had my day job. I was doing all my other stuff, right? So I wrote it over the course of a year. I'd gotten the acceptance letter from the publisher, I think, in December. And so really started writing in earnest in January, and submitted it just before the end of the year. So it took about a year to write. And then the editing process took about another 6 months, because there's multiple edits and revisions and copy editing, and then it has to go to print. So we submitted it, and then it came out in October. So it was about 6 to 8 months of sort of post-production.
Right. Yeah. Well, I don't want to, like, I've taken studious notes for my story that'll appear in the Suburban on this book. And, I don't want to give away the plot to anybody. And if we start going over chapter by chapter, we will. I mean, but I've kind of dropped some of the topics you deal with. But
Yeah.
I was reluctant to have a hot dog after I after I heard what you had to say, and I kind of know that hot dogs are really not good for you. But I was excused of profession craving
Yeah.
for a sequel
Yeah.
when you did it. I mean, I want to know without revealing the end because it was a very interesting ending. I would love there to be a sequel because I'd like to see where this doctor goes with
Yeah.
his love life and with. I mean, is there a possibility of a sequel?
There is the possibility of a sequel. I have written a sample chapter for a sequel on artificial sweeteners. So
Oh,
sort of
okay.
continuing the story, the food topic would be artificial sweeteners. So the treatise or the pitch is ready. A lot of it is really going to depend on how well the book sells.
Right,
If
right.
the book sells, the publishers will greenlight a sequel. So if you want to know how it ends, you
Yeah,
go out and really just buy up every copy that you can find in the
exactly,
bookstores. That's what's going to make
exactly.
it. I think there is still a story to be told from the narrative perspective because I do
Yes,
want to explore where these characters go, and I do have some ideas. I
yeah.
really want to expand the role of Rufus the dog, who only
Oh,
makes an
Rufus the
appearance
dog.
at the end.
Yeah, yeah. You could
Yeah.
do a whole chapter on dog food, first of all.
You could do a whole chapter there.
Yeah.
I'm almost curious. I almost wonder if you could spin this off and have a children's book from the perspective of Rufus the
You
dog.
could, and it's much shorter children's book. And then we can have
They
you
are.
come to Gardenview Elementary School and read it to the kindergarten
There
kids.
you go. So
Yeah,
there's a lot of potential there. So there's a
yeah.
lot of potential from the narrative point of view of how you spin these characters off. But there's no shortage of medical topics.
No shortage. Well, you know
No,
what? I
yeah,
was thinking, either your buddies there get
mm,
married or you get married, your
yeah,
character, even though it's not you, but we know
yeah.
it's you. So you get married. And I mean, let's think of the wedding cake. How unhealthy is that wedding cake? You and Casey could go on for hours and hours talking about the wedding cake and calories, like dieting. That would be
Yeah.
like, so first of all, I said to you before that this would make a great TV movie,
Yeah.
and with all of your contacts in the media, who
Mm,
knows? Maybe it'll
maybe.
be a made for TV movie. It could be great. It could be on Hallmark, the Hallmark station, or
Yes, it
Lifetime.
could.
So if it does, we just want to make sure that some filming is done at Laurel Hill Academy. That's our only
I think we
request.
could make it work. I think we can make it work. If somebody wants to put on like a
Yeah,
stage play of this sort of stuff, I think,
that's
yeah,
great idea.
it's you know
That's
what?
a great idea.
It is the type of thing where, because it is a very simple premise, at the end of the day, it's often just two or three people having a conversation.
Yes.
And you could easily do it inside. I mean, you have to sort of shorten the dialogue a little bit, but you could adapt this, I
I
think,
think
very
you nailed it
easily.
just now. I'm going to speak to the Siegel Center. I'm going to
Yeah.
speak to the Performing Arts program at Laurel Hill. Leave it with me, Dr.
Okay.
Labos. We're gonna make this happen. So it's a great book. How can people get it?
Anywhere where books are sold. So you can get it on Amazon. You can go to Chapters Indigo. You could go to your local independent bookstore and get it. So, Paragraph Books or any of the other independent bookstores in Montreal. It's everywhere. Go where books are sold. You can get it, or you can order it directly from the publisher at www.doescoffeecausecancer.com.
Okay, great. And I'm going to certainly recommend the Cote-saint-Luc Public Library
Yeah.
get a copy for their members to borrow. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it, and congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Christopher Labos has